Okay, so basically the elasticity of supply and demand determines how the tax burden is distributed between buyers and sellers. So the elasticity of supply and demand determines who is paying much of the taxes basically. And in figure 1, you can see the effect of a tax. So this graph shows you what happens when there is a tax imposed in a market. Uh, Usually when there is a tax, so either supply or the demand curve changes, but to make things simple, uh, it, it does not show how the demand and supply curves are changed, but basically you will see in figure 1 you will see the size of the tax, so how much the tax, if there is a tax imposed, you will see, for example, on the y-axis the prices buyers pay. So now because of the taxes, buyers pay much more higher than the previous equilibrium price of that product. And uh, you will also see that the prices that the supplier receive is much more lower as compared to the situation when there is no tax in the market. So in figure 1, the effect of a tax is being shown, and a tax on a good places a wedge between the price that buyers pay and the price that the sellers receive. The quantity of the good sold falls. So what happens is when there is a tax imposed on a certain product, producers are paying, consumers are paying a higher price than before. At the same time, suppliers are receiving a lower price as before. And also because the tax imposes a wage or it distorts the market, the total quantity sold will also decrease. We will talk about why this happened. One of the reasons is that it's no longer beneficial for the participant to either produce or consume. So basically they think like the price is too high, or I'm receiving too little money for that product, so I'm not producing that. Or you say, or the consumer will say like because of the taxes the prices are much more higher, so I will not buy that product at all. So as a result, the people will buy less, and that will reduce the quantity demanded or the quantity sold in the market. Okay, so now you understand what happens when a tax is imposed in a very basic terms. Um, Now the second subtopic is how a tax affect market participant. So now we will analyze each individual participant of the market and see what happens when there is a tax imposed on each of them. So basically the tax is imposed in general, and we will analyze how consumer surplus, producer surplus will be affected. Okay, in figure 2 you can see that the tax revenue is basically uh, is the amount of tax multiplied by the quantity of that product being taxed, and that's basically how much revenue the government receives. So when there is a tax on a certain product, the government receives the amount of that tax multiplied by the quantity of the sold product, and that's basically the revenue for the government. And yeah, so I have to quickly see. Yeah, so uh, yeah, so um, we will move to figure 3, and that's basically the summary of um, how consumer surplus, producer surplus, and government revenue will change as a result of taxation. Okay, so figure 3 is making it more easy to understand. So what happens is that uh, we can compare situations between welfare without a tax. So we will see what was the situation of consumer surplus and producer surplus before there was a tax in terms of the welfare. And then we will see how the welfare changes when a tax is being imposed. So figure 3 gives a quick summary of that. You can see in the graph that area A, B, and C, these are the consumer surplus area, and D, E, and F is the producer surplus area. After a tax is being imposed, the government revenue is the area of B and D. So that's basically how much revenue that government will receive. And as a result, the, the consumer surplus is reduced now. Now the consumer surplus is only the area A. And for the producers, their surplus is also reduced, and now their surplus is only the area F. And this area C and E, which is being shaded in the graph, these are basically the deadweight loss. So these are the loss that happens to the market as a result of imposing a tax. That was a general explanation that I've given. You can see these calculations in this graph. It shows the changes in consumer, producer, surplus, also tax revenue and total surplus. And you will see at the end, like the area of C and E is basically minus, so that's a change. And as a result of tax, that much of the total surplus will be lost in the market. So what we conclude from this is that the losses to buyers and sellers from a tax exceed the revenue raised by the government. So what happens is that the cost to the buyers and seller is much more than the revenue which has been generated by the government. And that is highlighted by the area of C and E. Again, why there is this C and E losses? It's because of the taxes, the prices of that good has increased. For example, the oil prices was 2 euros per liter before. Now government imposes 1 euro taxes on it, and now it is 3 euros. So what happens is that the price has increased. And as a result, some people will no longer use their car. They will not buy oil or gasoline because it's very much expensive. They will probably share car or use public transport or use bicycles to go to work or whatsoever. So they will not engage in a purchasing of gasoline or oil. And also the producers of the oil, because now they have to pay taxes, like this 1 euro extra tax is both on buyers and also on sellers. So they also have to pay these taxes. They will produce much less oil as compared to before. Why? Because they have to pay also taxes on the purchase of the oil, when they sell the oil to the consumer. And as a result, they will produce less. So there will be less buyers and sellers in the market, and that's why they will not engage in a trade between each other, and that's why there will be less oil sold and bought in the market, which is shown in the graph as a decrease from Q1 to Q2. So the quantity decreases from Q1 to Q2 because the oil has been expensive now, and people will not prefer to buy oil, and producers are not willing to produce much more oil. So that's why there is a deadweight loss in the market, and it's being explained as a loss in the total surplus of the market. Okay, I will move to the next topic. It's a subtopic. It's about deadweight losses and the gain from trade. There is an example in the books about house cleaning, and basically that shows how this deadweight loss, which I just explained in the example of oil, how this take place in another example. So they have given another example in the book, and I would recommend you that you read it. So when there is a tax, probably some buyers and sellers will no longer engage in a transaction, and that's basically a loss of surplus. And because there is a loss of transaction, or there is no transaction happening, what happens is that government will not be able to collect tax revenues on that transaction as well. So the government is also losing any revenue, or is not generating any revenue because of this deadweight loss. So the conclusion that we could draw from this example is that taxes causes deadweight losses because they prevent buyers and sellers from realizing some of the gains from the trade. So buyers and sellers, they will not engage in a trade because of the taxes, because it's a increase in the prices of that good for both buyers and sellers. The deadweight loss is a surplus that is lost because the tax discourages mutually beneficial trade. So deadweight loss is basically a surplus area which is being lost. Why? Because tax is discouraging people for a beneficial transaction or a beneficial trade to take place. So that was all about the first topic, about the deadweight losses of taxation. And I will move to the second topic, main topic, and it's about the determinants of the deadweight loss. So here we will talk what determines whether the deadweight loss of a tax is large or small. So how you will understand if a certain tax will have a larger deadweight loss or smaller one. And the answer to this question is the price elasticity of supply and demand. So this elasticity of supply and demand will determine the size of deadweight loss. I will not go into the details of it. I will just say the four main summaries. You can read the example in the book, and it's also summarized in figure 5. So in figure 5 we have inelastic supply on panel A, and when there is when the supply is relatively inelastic, the deadweight loss of a tax is small. So when the supply is inelastic, deadweight loss is small. When the supply is relatively elastic, as in panel B, the deadweight loss of a tax is larger. So you can see that in panel B, when the supply is elastic, the deadweight loss is also large. On the other hand, when the demand is relatively inelastic, the deadweight loss of the tax is small. And when the demand is relatively elastic, the deadweight loss of a tax is large. So these are the main four conditions that will determine if the deadweight loss of a certain tax is higher or smaller or larger. It requires more to get the concept of elasticity first, elasticity of supply and demand. And if you get that, so these four conditions will be easy for you. So what happens is, like for example in C, when the demand is inelastic, for example, taking the example of gasoline, or so your demand is inelastic in a situations that you will buy the oil, doesn't matter how much the price is. So your demand is inelastic. If the price has increased from 1 to 2, from 2 euros to 3 euros, you will still buy that product. So what happens is that because you are still buying the gasoline, the deadweight loss is much more lower. Why? Because you didn't stop buying oil, which is basically a deadweight loss if you don't buy oil. But because your demand is inelastic, you have to buy oil at any price. So because of that, the deadweight loss is relatively small. But if your demand was elastic, you could see that the price of oil has increased from 2 euros to 3 euros. Your demand is elastic, so you'll not buy the oil anymore, and as a result, there is no purchase of oil at the market taking place, and as a result, there is a greater deadweight lost in the market. Why? Because you are not purchasing oil anymore, and if you are not purchasing the oil, government is not generating the revenue that they have imposed on the tax. Producers are not able to sell their oil, so that these all will result in a deadweight lost. So that was I give like a short example for these conditions, and what we conclude from this point is that the greater the elasticity of supply and demand, the greater the deadweight loss of a tax. So if both supply and demand are more elastic, the deadweight loss of that product will also be much more higher. Why? Because people will shift. Either buyer will shift, they will not produce, or consumer will shift, they will not purchase, and that basically increases a higher deadweight losses in the market. And there is one case study about the deadweight loss debate, and it's about the supply of labor. You can have a look at it and you can read, and that gives you an example of how the concept applies in the case of supply of labor. Okay, that also concludes our second topic, and we have one more topic to go. And yeah, so our last topic is about deadweight loss and the tax revenue as tax varies. So what happens to the deadweight loss and the total tax revenue when the tax is being changed? So we see how different tax rates affect tax revenue and deadweight loss. And for that, the summary is given in figure 6. So to put it in simple words, panel A shows like a small tax. So when there is a small tax, like a little government imposes like a small amount of tax on a certain product, the deadweight loss is also small and the revenue is also small. For example, if there is instead of €1 tax on oil, there is only like 10 cent tax on oil. So what happens is that because it's only 10 cent, government revenue will be also little. It will be not that much as compared to the case when the taxes would have been €1. And also deadweight loss is also small. Why? Because it's only 10 cent, people does not care much about, so they will still buy oil, and or the producer will still produce oil. So there is no loss or deadweight loss in this case. There is, but very small. So only a small people will shift their purchases of oil, or they will use less autos and not buy oil at all when the tax is very little. And panel B, we see like the taxes medium, so there is a medium size tax rate, and as a result the revenue of the government is also increasing. So in this case, if the tax is 50 cent, now government is receiving much more revenue as compared to the first case. And also the deadweight loss is increased here. Why? Because now some people say like 50 cent is quite much, so probably most of the or half of the people will no longer buy or purchase oil from the tank station, and that will also result in a high deadweight losses. And panel C, you will see like that the tax rate is really large, and the deadweight loss is also much more larger. So it could be, I don't know, €2 of taxes on gasoline. So it's like too much. It's like double the price of the taxes in our example. So what happens is like most of the people will no longer purchase oil to use in their cars. And as a result, the deadweight loss is also high. And the government revenue in this case is much more smaller. Why? Because most of the people are no longer buying oil, so that's why when they are not buying, so government cannot charge taxes. So only a few people who are buying the oil at a high price, they are paying the taxes, and that's only a little amount of revenue for the government. Which brings us to panel D and E, and both of them summarizes what happens to deadweight loss and total government revenue. So I will explain one at a time. So at panel D, uh, what happens is that as the tax rate increases, the deadweight loss also increases. So you can see that in panel D. And this graph shows the relationship between both of them, and it's an increasing curve. And in panel E, basically, it's very important, and this curve is called a Laffer curve. It basically says like when the tax increases, so the government revenue will also increase, but to a certain amount. So the taxes increases, and then government will also receive revenue. But you cannot um, raise tax forever. So there is some point that people will stop buying that product, and they will no longer pay taxes. So what will happen is that because of the taxes are that high, people are not buying, and as a result, the revenue of the government will also decrease. So this curve will uh, will be going back down, so it will be shifted downwards, and that shows, as we said in panel C that when the taxes are large, the total revenue is uh, very small for the government, and that's basically showed in Laffer curve, which says that uh, as the tax increases, government revenue will also increases to a certain point, and after that point, when the tax increases a little more than that, the total revenue will actually decrease, not increase. And you can read about this Laffer curve also in the case study. The case study is the Laffer curve in the supply side economics. And yeah, I encourage you to read this case study. And that basically concludes our session today. So I will say a few lines up at the conclusion. First, that taxes are costly to market participants, not only because taxes transfer resources from those participants to the government, but also because they alter incentive and distorts market outcome. So at the end, taxes, it's not only because government is receiving money from the taxes, but also it distorts the market, and as a result, the deadweight loss happens, and that is not good for the total welfare of the economy. So that was all for this chapter. And I also noticed like the concept of taxation. There is a book by uh, an economist called Arthur M. Oaklon, and he has developed this concept of the leaky bucket. And this concept says that the money must be carried from the rich to the poor in a leaky bucket. Oaklon attributed these losses to the administrative costs of taxation and transferring into incentive effects. So what the theory of the Oaklon says, or the leaky bucket says, is that whenever there is a tax, for example, on the rich people, and then the revenue of the tax is used to help the poor people, what happened is like it's considered this as carrying this money in a leaky bucket of water, or a leaky bucket. So when the bucket is leaked, the water will drop down. So by the time it reaches the poor people, they will receive much less as compared to the amount that the rich people has paid. So that basically also explains the concept of deadweight loss, for example. What happens is that the benefit that the government receiving in this case is much more lesser than the cost being incurred to buyers and sellers. So that's the main conclusion uh, of, of this chapter, and that's basically explained the deadweight loss. What happens is that when the government imposes taxation on a market, the cost of this taxation is much more to the buyer and seller as compared to the benefit that the government receives. That's all for this chapter that I wanted to discuss. We will continue our discussion of the consumer and producer surplus and in the next chapter, and we will see how this concept basically help us understand international trade. So we will apply these concepts again to the topic of international trade, and see what we can or what we can learn from that, or what are the main conclusion that we can take from this concept of consumer surplus and producer surplus. So I will finish this lecture at this point, and I hope you have get an idea of the concept of deadweight loss and how taxation affects consumer and producer surplus. See you in the next lecture, and goodbye.